In the Middle Ages, being an assassin wasn't glamorous. There were no second chances, no fame, and no safe escape. One mistake meant torture or a public execution. This is the story they never tell you why it truly sucked to be a medieval assassin. Those shadowy figures who crept through castle halls and darkened alleys to change history with a blade and a whisper. While Hollywood makes them look cool, the truth is, being a medieval assassin seriously sucked. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear. No one in medieval times woke up and said, "You know what? I'd like to stab a nobleman in the throat for 12 silver coins and the honor of hiding in a barrel for 3 days." Becoming an assassin wasn't a career path. It was more like a last stop on the life went horribly wrong train. Most medieval assassins weren't mysterious loners trained in mountaintop temples. They were desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, ex-thieves with decent aim, or people so far off society's radar they could kill a man and still not be noticed in the census. If you were well off, you didn't become an assassin. You hired one. If you had a title, land, or even a goat to your name, you were in management. But if you just escaped Data's prison, had a reputation for solving problems, and could sneak into a tavern without being seen, congratulations. Someone somewhere was about to slide a coin purse across the table and whisper a name, and that name wasn't a fun one. You weren't asked to take out Bob, the quiet turnip farmer. It was usually a corrupt baron, a bishop with too much gold, or someone who eat 12 bodyguards and a moat. The pay tempting, the job horrifying, but by the time someone considered it, they had nothing left to lose. No family, no future, and definitely no dental plan. Plus, let's not forget the absolute lack of job perks. No pension, no glory, no evenings off. You couldn't exactly hang up a shingle that said quiet eliminations by appointment. You just had to stay quiet, move fast, and never ever tell anyone what you did for a living, especially not loudly over ale at the inn. Oh yeah, I'm a traveling carpet seller. The stains die. So yes, nobody dreamed of being a medieval assassin. They landed there because the world chewed them up and spat them out, wearing a hood and holding a rusty dagger. You weren't the hero. You weren't even the villain. You were the footnote that made everyone nervous and probably didn't live to enjoy the coin. Let's burst the first myth wide open. Medieval assassins didn't train under candlelight in some hidden monastery with wise mentors and inspirational flute music in the background. There was no montage, no teacher, no pep talk. If you learned anything, it was by not dying the first few times you tried. Most assassins weren't trained professionals. They were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of direction and the ability to climb quietly without sneezing. If you had military experience, great. That meant you knew how to hold a knife properly. If not, well, stabbing someone is fairly intuitive, but escaping afterward with both kidneys still intact, that takes skill or luck. Usually, just luck. There were no manuals, no guild orientation meetings, no safety briefings. You didn't get taught how to spot a body double or where nobles keep their bedroom exits. You figured it out while hanging from a windowsill, wondering if you just crept into the servants' quarters again. Poison. That was trial and error with heavy emphasis on error. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes your target just got mildly dizzy and more suspicious of his soup. Sometimes you drank the wrong cup. There was no medieval poison control hotline. Just hope, herbal guesswork, and a strong stomach. Sure, if you were lucky, and I mean lottery lucky, you might have picked up some skills from thieves or mercenaries. Maybe an older assassin showed you how to walk without squeaking on cobblestones. But mentoring wasn't standard. It was rare and short-lived, because assassins don't retire. They disappear. Weapons training. Forget it. You weren't carrying a broadsword. You had a dagger you stole off a guard, maybe a garrow if you were feeling fancy, and whatever else fit under your cloak without jingling. So, no, You weren't some shadowy martial arts master. You were a guy with calloused hands, quiet footsteps, and a deeply unhealthy relationship with alleyways. Success didn't come from training. It came from survival. You learned how to kill by doing it quickly, sloppily, then vanishing before anyone could sketch your face and tack it to a church door. In short, your education was brutal, practical, and offered zero graduation ceremonies. Just bruises, bloodstains, and the creeping realization that you were very much on your own. Let's talk about why you became an assassin in the first place. Coin. Cold. Heavy. Jangly. Deliciously spendable coin. The promise of it is what got you into this. But the reality, you got paid in lies. When someone hires an assassin, they don't want a long-term relationship. They want a one-time service, no paperwork, and ideally no witnesses, including you. They offer you a pouch of silver, half now, half when the job is done. That's if they're feeling generous. But here's the thing. When the job is done is code for after we verify you didn't mess it up or make us look bad or leave a trail that leads back to us or survive long enough to tell anyone about it. So you do the job. You sneak through shadows, risk your life, maybe kill a baron in his sleep. Not pretty, not poetic. And when you return, yes, about that payment. The client fled terribly sorry. Or worse, they try to kill you. A knife to the gut is cheaper than a bonus. And even when you do get paid, it's never quite enough. Not for the risk, not for the blood, not for the 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack with fleas and moral regret. You get a handful of coins, a curt nod, and a reminder. You were never here. Also, fun fact, some contracts were fake. Political traps. You'd be told to assassinate someone dangerous, only to find out it was a decoy with guards waiting. Congratulations, just walked into a sting operation with your name already carved on the gallows. And even when the deal was real, you couldn't exactly go to court and file a complaint. Your Honor, I'd like to sue Lord Edmund for breach of assassin contract. The only court you'd see was the one where you were the exhibit. So you learned to take what you could, demand payment up front, and trust absolutely no one. Not even the greasy little scribe who swore this job would change your life. It did, mostly by shortening it. Being an assassin meant living on broken promises and vanishing before they broke you. So, you've taken the job. You've been lied to about the pay. You're probably going to die. Now, let's talk. Forget the fantasy novels and sneaky video games. There were no retractable wrist blades, smoke bombs, enchanted daggers, or crossbows that folded neatly into your boot. Your toolkit consisted of whatever you could steal, sharpen, or hide beneath a tattered cloak without clanking. If you were lucky, and I mean found a gold coin and a dead man's shoe, lucky you had a good dagger. Not ornate, not curved like a dragon's tooth, just sharp, hopefully rust-free, and ideally one that didn't smell like the last guy you stabbed with it. Poison. It existed, sure, but it wasn't as glamorous as a slow drip into a wine goblet. Most medieval poisons were unpredictable, made from plants, minerals, or toad guts. Some worked instantly, some took hours. Some made your victim vomit for 2 days, and then recover. Angrier, and now very suspicious of stew. Ropes, occasionally useful. You could strangle, climb, or tie something up with one, but you'd better know how to use it fast, because nothing kills the mood like trying to wrestle someone while muttering, "Wait! Which knot? Goes under again?" Bowsy effective. Yes, if you had won, knew how to shoot it, and weren't trying to smuggle it through a palace disguised as a flower arranger. Most assassinations were up close and personal. No time for elegant marksmanship. Just quick, quiet, and hopefully not messy enough to slip in. And you didn't get backups. If your blade bent, broke, or fell down a well, time to improvise. Slate, roof tile, maybe. Rusty nail, worth a shot. Shoe buckle with intent. Desperate times. You carried your tools hidden in hems, boots, or inside hollowed-out bread if needed, and you kept them close, not for safety, but because, in this line of work, your weapon was your best friend, your boss, and your only retirement plan. There were no upgrades, no tinkering with gear between missions. You didn't polish your kit. You prayed it didn't betray you mid-strike. Because in the end, it wasn't the weapon that did the killing. It was you alone, poorly equipped, and expected to perform miracles with a spoon and a prayer. Assassins weren't hired to take out random drunks in back alleys. No one paid you to stab Jeff, the sleepy candlemaker. Your targets were important. Nobles, bishops, military officers, sometimes even royalty. And those people, they were very hard to kill. First, there were the guards. Not one or two. Dozens. Armed, armored, and well-fed. Some guarded the front. Some bike. Some just stood there looking intimidating, daring you to blink wrong. You'd spend days memorizing patrol patterns, door creaks, and exactly how many stairs it took before the knight with asthma needed a breather. Second, there were walls. Castles didn't have front porches. They had gaitas, murder halls, and mows full of things that bite. If you didn't fall into the water, you still had to worry about arrow slits and boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil. Your job description included Maget Flamade for peeking. Third, there were the servants and staff, the cooks, scribes, and stable boys. One wrong look from you and they'd be whispering to the guard captain faster than you could say, "I'm just the herbalist." Assassins weren't just fighting swords. They were fighting gossip. And medieval gossip travels at light speed, if it means someone gets to keep their head. And finally, your actual target? Paranoid, rightful. These people were surrounded by backstabbers, relatives with claims to their titles, and 36 people pretending to like them. They didn't eat without a tester. They didn't sleep without 3 locks on the door. Some even slept in decoy beds or rotated rooms like a deadly version of musical chairs. And don't get excited if you hear they're attending a feast. Yes, they'll be drunk, but so will you. And you'll still have to get past the royal guards. 3 dogs, a very alert jester, and 50 witnesses holding tankers. Even getting close to your target could take weeks. Posing as a servant, bribing a chambermaid, hiding in barrels. And when the moment finally came, you had one shot. One precise, perfect, non-squeaky, non-bloody ghost vanish in the night moment. Or you'd become the next public deterrent swinging from the castle gate with a sign that read, "Nice try." Let's be honest. When you picture a medieval assassin, you probably imagine sleek, black robes, leather braces, maybe a mysterious hood billowing in the moonlight. Reality, you looked like a sick goat herder with something to hide. Disguises in the Middle Ages weren't exactly high fashion. You didn't have custom-tailored cloaks or retractable armor. You had whatever you could scavenge. Peasant rags, a monk's robe 2 sizes too big, or the remains of a guard uniform that definitely still smelled like its previous owner. The goal was to blend in. But blending in meant looking like everyone else who hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, limped from old injuries, and had a nervous twitch from malnutrition. You didn't look suspicious because of your cloak. You looked suspicious because you kept adjusting your belt to hide a dagger wrapped in cheesecloth. And forget masks. There were no Guy Fawkes options. Most face coverings just made you look like a leper, which was great for avoiding conversation, but terrible for entering parties. If anyone asked who you were, you had to think fast. I'm Brother Tobias. I take care of silent prayer and rooftop maintenance. Even assuming you made it past the guards, noble households weren't full of idiots. Servants noticed unfamiliar faces, especially ones that fumbled chamber pots and couldn't name the cook's cat. You were always one. I've never seen you before, away from being clubbed with a candlestick. And if your disguise did work, congratulations. You now had to stay in character for hours, while pretending not to notice all the very stab-worthy people wandering by. Also, wigs, they didn't exist. If you needed to look older or younger, you were stuck smearing dirt on your face, squinting, and hoping no one got close enough to notice that your beard was glued on with honey. The truth was, your disguise didn't protect you. It gave you maybe 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you had to be gone. Invisible, or very, very convincing. And if anyone saw through it, well, Let's just say no one wants to be the assassin caught in the bishop's laundry room wearing a nun's habit and holding a sword, especially not on a feast day. In medieval times, if you were an assassin, you didn't have a team. You didn't have a sidekick with a crossbow, a clever alchemist in a secret lair, or a handler who gave you coded scrolls and warm encouragement. You had you, a rusty dagger, and crippling trust issues. There were no guilds, at least not ones you could actually count on. And if there were whispers of a brotherhood of assassins, it was mostly tavern talk, fueled by me and boredom. You were more likely to meet a ghost than another professional killer who wanted to network. Why the isolation? Because in your business, the fewer people who knew you existed, the longer you lived. Every contact was a risk, every loose tongue a potential noose. Even your client might not know your real name, and if they did, you were already planning your exit. Companionship? Laughable. Friends asked questions. Lovers noticed bruises, bloodstains, and why you always slept with a blade under the pillow. You couldn't settle down. You couldn't afford to. One mistake, one person recognizing you in a market, and your whole life turned into a sprint for the nearest sewer grate. Even fellow criminals kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers were sociable. You were that guy who makes people disappear. They feared you, or worse, saw you as a walking liability. No one wanted to share stew with someone whose occupation could attract a mob with torches. And don't expect sympathy. You couldn't tell anyone how hard it was to sleep after silently strangling a corrupt bishop. If you talked about your job, people assumed you were either lying or dangerous. And they weren't wrong. So, you kept your secrets, your scars, and your weapons to yourself. At inns, you sat in the darkest corner, back to the wall, eyes always scanning the door. You never drank too much. You never stayed more than a night. You didn't say your name unless someone paid you first. And ebb and tin, it probably wasn't your real one. Being a medieval assassin meant perfecting the art of vanishing, not just in a crowd, but from every life you never got to have. Let's say you took the job. You planned your route. You bribed the right doorman. You disguised yourself as a very convincing chimney sweep. And then you froze. Maybe the target turned around unexpectedly. Maybe they were with their child. Maybe you got the shakes at the worst possible moment and your knife hand trembled like a terrified squirrel. Guess what? You're now dead, because failure for a medieval assassin wasn't a slap on the wrist or a bad performance review. It was a public, painful, and wildly theatrical death, often involving ropes, fire, wheels, or sharp iron devices with names like the Bone Cracker's Delight. Missing the kill meant blowing the whole operation. Your target lived, and immediately told everyone that someone tried to murder them. Suddenly, you weren't a shadow. You were a wanted man with a detailed description and probably a crude sketch, tacked to every tavern wall within 30 meters. And those guards you once snuck past, now they're motivated. Sometimes it wasn't even your target you had to worry about. It was your client. If you failed, you are no longer an asset. You were a liability. Someone who could be tortured, interrogated, or worse. Talk. The very people who paid you would be the first to put out a second contract on you, and there were no second chances. No. Sorry. The blade slipped. I'll try again tomorrow. You had one shot, one moment in time, and if you blew it, the best you could hope for was to die quickly before anyone found out who hired you. Failure also meant shame. The silent, humiliating kind. You didn't just fail to kill. You failed to be invisible, to be perfect. And for assassins, perfection was survival. Anything less might as well paint a target on your back and start practicing your final word speech. It didn't matter how many jobs you'd done before. No one cared that you succeeded 12 times. Because, in this profession, you're only as good as your last kill. And if your last kill didn't happen, you'd better start running. So, you did it. The plan worked. The dagger struck true. No screams, no guards. Just a clean drop to the floor and a very important person who now wasn't congratulations, now run for your life. Because being a successful assassin in medieval times didn't mean sipping wine on a rooftop while the city burns behind you. It meant fleeing through back alleys with someone's blood on your boots and a dog already sniffing your trail. There was no victory lap, no post-job drink with colleagues, no casual debrief with your client. You didn't even get a moment to admire your work. The moment your blade struck, your new job became escaping everyone who now wants to murder you in increasingly creative ways. Guards coming, doors locked, horses tied up on the other side of town. You probably bleeding. You had to plan your exit before the kill. Routes, disguises, fallbacks, maybe a boatman who owed you a favor, or at least didn't ask questions because the city would go on lockdown within minutes. No one wanted a scandal, and lockdown meant closed gates, armed checkpoints, and a dozen angry men with swords who all just received your rough sketch and the phrase, maybe armed and extremely stabby. And let's talk about the client. Assuming they actually planned to pay you, they weren't going to meet you at a cozy tavern with a smile and a thank you card. They'd probably vanish, too. Because an assassin who just completed a job is the most dangerous person alive. You knew too much. You'd proven you could get into places others couldn't. So, even when you succeeded, you walked away with coin in one hand and a giant target on your back. And what did you win? A week of sleeping in hofts, bribing ferry captains, shaving your beard in the dark, and pretending your name was Brother Lucian as you tried to blend in with monks heading east. Because success didn't mean survival. It meant starting the whole game over in a new city, under a new name, with even more people looking for you this time. So yes, you made the kill. Now run like hell. If being a medieval assassin wasn't already miserable enough, poor, hunted, and sleeping in places that smelled like goat, you also had to deal with the wonderfully creative paranoia of the people around you. Because in the Middle Ages, assassins weren't just feared. They were considered cursed. To the average peasant, you weren't just a killer in a hood. You were some unholy creature who whispered to demons and smeared frog guts on your blade under a full moon. Why else would you be able to sneak past guards and vanish in the dark? Logic wasn't exactly popular back then, but superstition, oh, that was everywhere. Some believed assassins could shake. Others claimed you were invisible unless bathed in holy water. One popular tale suggested assassins made pacts with forest spirits and could breathe death through walls. Imagine walking through a village and hearing a woman mutter, "Don't make eye contact. He might hex the baby." Even your tools were suspect. Carrying a dagger. Clearly, it was forged in a cursed forge, using poison. That wasn't chemistry. That was witchcraft. And you probably stirred it with a severed toe under a blood moon. You'd think this fear might help you. After all, people avoided you, right? But the reality was worse. Superstitious mobs don't hesitate. They don't ask questions, they throw stones, set fires, and shout things like, "Burn him before he calls lightning." Your reputation made people overreact. The second someone died unexpectedly, illness, accident, choking on a chicken bone, someone would whisper, maybe it was a shadow man, maybe it was him. You could be hunted just for existing in the same village as a suspicious death. That meant you had to keep moving. Always. Stay too long and suddenly a priest is ringing a bell while 5 angry farmers hold pitchforks like they've been waiting for this moment their entire lives. And heaven help you if you were caught with anything remotely weird. Dried herbs, strange coins, or even a foreign accent. That's all it took for someone to shout sorcerer and light a torch. In a world that believed monsters wore human faces, being too quiet, too clever, or too fast made you a threat. And in medieval logic, threats had to die quickly and preferably on fire. Poison, the assassin's weapon of elegance. A quiet kill, no mess, no screaming, no steel on bone. Just a sip, a stagger, a sigh, and done. That's the theory. In practice, poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to win a bar fight with herbal tea and a bad attitude. First off, poisons weren't reliable. You didn't have access to purified cyanide or a neat little pill labeled fast-acting doom. You had plants, mushrooms, minerals, maybe the occasional toad. You had to gather, grind, and pray. And a bent in it might just give the target a stomachache and a renewed commitment to to his anti-acid guard team. There was no scientific measurement. You didn't dose precisely. You eyeballed it. A pinch too little and the noble just vomits and cancels dinner. A pinch too much and you die from exposure before the first course is served. Also, medieval kitchens were chaotic. You couldn't just waltz in and season the soup with night. You had to bribe or impersonate a cook, sneak in while no one was watching. Or, worst of all, try to poison a meal that would go through 3 tasters and a dog. Yes, a dog. And if your victim was a noble, they didn't just eat food. They treated it like a military operation. Meals were tasted, blessed, and sniffed by everyone from the steward to the jester. By the time the food hit their plate, it had passed through more security than a royal wedding. Even assuming you did it, you slipped in the poison. It wasn't detected and the target actually ate it. The next part was wildly unpredictable. Some poisons took hours. Some may took days. 1 minute your mark is laughing at a joke. The next he's clutching his stomach and demanding to see his astrologer. And if they survived, guess who they'd blame? Not the cook. Not the taster. You. The quiet man with the herbal knowledge and twitchy eyes. So poisoning wasn't efficient. It was risky, slow, and full of variables. None of them in your favor. And if you were caught, you didn't get a quick death. You got interrogated with tools until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the Duke to the dog. You'd think that if you successfully changed the course of history by removing a tyrant, sabotaging a royal bloodline, or silencing a political threat, someone would remember your name. Nope. You were an assassin. That meant your name was never meant to be remembered. At best, you were a rumor. Some hooded figure, a foreigner with cold eyes, or the quiet man who never finished his ale. You might have pulled off the most legendary hit of the century, and still ended up as a mysterious death in the official record. In fact, that was the point. Your client didn't want a story. They wanted plausible deniability. The fewer people who knew who did it, the safer they were, and the less likely they were to end up poisoned by their own assassin. So, your name was buried the moment the job was done. If you even used a real one, you didn't sign your work. You didn't brag. You didn't keep trophies. You didn't exist outside the moment of the kill. And if someone did know your name, that was a loose end. And in your profession, loose ends had a very short shelf life. And forget about honor. There were no medals for silence. No stone monuments for the man who stopped the war with one dagger in the night. If a noble wanted a statue, they commissioned one for themselves. You got a wooden box, an unmarked grave, or if things went really badly, a head on a spike-labeled traitor. Sometimes your name was known only so it could be cursed. You'd become a whispered warning. Don't cross the king. Remember what happened to Lord Ulrich, yes? And the man who did it, gone like a ghost. That was your legacy. Not fame, not fear, just absence. You weren't supposed to leave a mark. You were supposed to vanish. And if you stuck around long enough to be known, that was a fatal mistake, because in the medieval world, heroes got remembered. Assassins got erased. So, you survived. You got the job done. You even managed to get paid. A miracle in itself. Now, all you have to do is lay low. Keep your head down and trust that your client will honor the deal and protect your identity. Right, wrong. Because in the world of medieval assassination, there was one rule even more sacred than don't get caught. Never trust anyone, especially the person paying you. Your client, be they a noble, a merchant, or a bishop with ambition and very loose morals, didn't hire you out of respect. They hired you because they needed something awful done, and you were the sharpest tool in the shadows. Once the job was complete, you became a liability. You knew too much. You knew who wanted who dead, when, why, and possibly how much they were willing to pay for it. That made you dangerous, not just to their enemies, but to them. So, what did they do? They ghosted you. They denied they ever met you. Or worse, they sent someone else after you to clean up to tie off the contract with something sharper than ink. There were even cases where clients double-booked, hiring one assassin to do the job, and another to kill the first one immediately after. No refunds, just reduced risk. And if you dared try to blackmail a client, threaten to expose them, That was bold. And also your final mistake. Because powerful people in the Middle Ages didn't negotiate with assassins. They crushed them. If your client had a shred of honor, a rare species indeed, you might get paid and left alone. But Ibn 10, you'd still have to assume they were watching you from a distance with someone already sharpening steel and memorizing your walk. You were the secret that couldn't talk, the shadow that couldn't stay. Even success wasn't enough to earn trust, because in their eyes, if you killed once, you could kill again. And no one, not even the person who hired you, wanted to be next. Let's say somehow you beat the odds. You survived. The kills, the lies, the poisonings, the betrayals. You outlived your enemies, your employers, and probably your own sense of morality. Now what? You retire. Absolutely not. Because in medieval times, assassins didn't get retirement plans. There were no farewell banquets, no quiet cottages by the sea, no pensions paid in gold coins and grateful whispers. You didn't fade into a peaceful life. You vanished or you died. Often both. The problem was simple. You were never safe. Even if you walked away from the job, your past didn't. You had too many secrets in your head, too many names in your memory, and too much blood on your hands. People didn't want you retired. They wanted you forgotten, which usually meant buried. And even if no one came after you, and that's a big if, you had to live with a constant fear that a new assassin, young and eager to prove himself, had just received a contract for a shadowy figure who used to be someone dangerous. So, you changed your name again. You moved to a village where no one asked questions. You faked a limp, sold herbs, pretended you once worked as a guard. But, Ibn 10, you didn't sleep well. You avoided crowds. You always sat facing the door. You kept your dagger under the floorboard next to the pouch of coins you never touched, because it still smelled like the man you earned it from. And you couldn't trust yourself either. Years of silent killings and quick escapes did something to your brain. Every knock on the door made you flinch. Every stranger on the road might recognize you. You stopped dreaming because dreaming was dangerous. You couldn't love. You couldn't relax. You couldn't laugh too loud. You lived like a ghost, pretending to be a man. The truth was, there was no endgame for a medieval assassin. Just a slow, cold fade into obscurity. Always mobbing, always watching. Until one day you slipped into the dark and no one noticed. And maybe that was the best you could hope for. By now, you've probably figured it out. Being a medieval assassin wasn't darkly romantic. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even all that profitable. It was a green thankless, short-lived career wrapped in blood-stained linen and followed by a crowd of people who wanted you dead. You wouldn't last. Not a week, maybe not even a day, because you'd start with the wrong assumptions. That you'd be sleek, in control, a whisper in the dark. But what you'd really be is cold, hungry, and one bad guess away from the noose. You'd slip into town, cloak pulled tight, ready for action, only to discover that your target move locations. The guards are drunk, but trigger-happy, and the stable boy you paid for information just sold you out for a mug of ale and a piece of bread. You'd freeze at the wrong time, stab the wrong guy, get spotted by someone's maid who once saw your face near the chapel, and suddenly you're not a shadow. You're the problem. Then what? You run. But you're not used to medieval terrain. The mud, the uneven cobblestones, the absolutely insane number of loose chickens in the street. You slip, fall, get tackled by a guard named Thomas who just got dumped and is looking for an outlet. And let's say you survive that. Then you deal with the aftermath. No allies, no honor, and no future. Just whispers suspicion and the growing realization that even if you succeed, the best you can hope for is to die old and alone, hiding behind a false name in a village that still believes in fairies. So, no, you wouldn't last. And frankly, you shouldn't try, because the assassin's life wasn't cool. It was a cruel machine that chewed people up and spat out nothing but shadows. It offered power without peace and purpose without a place in the world. You didn't make history. You erased yourself from it. And the only thing waiting for you at the end was silence. A silence no one would question because no one even remembered you were there in the first place. Before she was the feared queen of Macedonia, Olympus was known as Mertile, a Maloian princess from the rugged tribal lands of Her people claimed descent from Achilles himself, and whether or not the blood of heroes truly ran in her veins, one thing was certain. This was not a woman born for the sidelines of history. From a young age, Myrtle was steeped in mystery and ritual. Her upbringing was shaped not just by politics, but by prophecy, ecstatic rites, and a reverence for the ancient gods. She wasn't the type of princess who smiled and embroidered tapestries. No, she was drawn to serpents, omens, and the frenzied ceremonies of the cult of Dionysus, where women danced barefoot in the moonlight and called upon the divine in states of trance. Her connection to the gods wasn't performative. It was personal. She didn't merely worship, she embodied. According to ancient sources, likely written by men both terrified and enthralled, she kept sacred snakes in her chambers and even allowed them to coil beside her in bed. Whether this was a literal fact, or the kind of slander that powerful women attract like flies, we'll never know. But it stuck. To her allies, it made her divine. To her enemies, it made her dangerous. Her real power began not in a battlefield or throne room, but in the uneasy flicker of torchlight, among the whispers of priestesses and the curling bodies of serpents. She wasn't just a princess. She was a living oracle, a woman touched by something older than politics and colder than steel. So when Philip II of Macedon, brutal, brilliant, and famously horny, arrived at the island of Samothrace for a religious initiation, he didn't just meet a beautiful princess. He met a mystery he couldn't resist. Their marriage wasn't just a political alliance. It was a collision of prophecy and power, and from the very beginning, it was full of omens. Some said lightning struck the sky on their wedding night. Others claimed Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb. All of it would become legend. But one thing is certain. The union of Olympias and Philip didn't just create a child. It created Alexander the Great, and she intended to shape his destiny from the very first breath. Olympia's marriage to Philip II was not the fairy tale one might expect for a queen who would one day birth an empire. From the beginning, it was a combustible mix of prophecy, pride, and paranoia. Philip, ruthless, charismatic, and already collecting wives like trophies, married Olympias around 357 CE. She was likely just a teenager, but she wasn't naive. She saw in Philip a man whose ambition matched her own and perhaps even a divine match for her spiritual destiny. Macedon wasn't exactly an easy kingdom to walk into. It was a land of iron and ambition where kings were killed by cousins and brothers turned into rivals overnight. But Olympias, the priestess of Papyrus, walked in with her head held high and eyes already on the crown. Their marriage was rocky from the start. Philip, for all his political genius, was not built for monogamy. He would go on to marry multiple women, often for alliances, always for power. But Olympias wasn't one to sit quietly in the shadows. She held her own court, maintained her own alliances, and was known to turn to oracles and rites to divine her future and perhaps Philip's fate. Then came the birth of Alexander. Even that was wrapped in celestial drama. Legends sigh. Olympus dreamed that a thunderbolt struck her womb and that flames danced around her child without burning him. Philip reportedly had a vision of sealing his wife's womb with a lion. Yes, a literal lion. Whether they believed these visions or invented them, they certainly acted as if Alexander was destined to rule not just a kingdom but the world. But even as the child was celebrated, cracks in the royal marriage deepened. Olympus resented Philip's other wives, especially his Macedonian bride, Cleopatra, whom he married later in life. This was more than a domestic issue. It was a threat. Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and any son she bore would be purer in the eyes of the local nobility, a direct threat to Alexander's future. Olympia saw it clearly. The palace wasn't just a home, it was a battlefield, and she would use every snake, dream, ritual, and whisper she had to make sure her son wasn't just remembered, but crowned. She was no longer Myrtle. She was Olympus now, and no one would take her son's throne without facing her wrath. By the time Alexander was a teenager, the Macedonian palace in Pella had become a war zone of veiled insults. political maneuvering, and bitter rivalries. Olympus wasn't just fighting for influence, she was fighting for survival. She knew that the court was filled with snakes, but she was the one who taught them how to bite. Philip II had begun to distance himself from her. He was campaigning more, drinking more, and perhaps, worst of all, listening more to his Macedonian advisors. The final blow came when he married a young noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, not to be confused with the Cleopatra of Egypt. This Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and her uncle Attalus was one of Philip's top generals. To Olympias, it wasn't just betrayal. It was a declaration of war. The marriage ceremony was a disaster. At the feast, Attalus drunkenly mocked Olympus and Alexander, calling into question the legitimacy of Alexander's birth. Was he really Philip's son? Or was he the child of a god, as Olympus liked to claim? It was meant as an insult, but Olympia seized the myth. Let them believe her son was touched by Zeus. It made him untouchable. Alexander stormed out of the feast. Olympia left Macedon entirely, retreating to Epirus. But her exile was not defeat. It was strategy. In her homeland, she was still royalty. She could gather support, whisper in ears, and watch as Philip's palace began to rot from within. She didn't need to be physically present to be dangerous. Then came the shock wave. Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, just as he was about to invade Persia, just as he was on the verge of crowning himself not just king of Macedon, but potential emperor of the known world. The question that echoed through every marble corridor and torchlit hall was the same. Who did it? Was it Pausanias, the jilted bodyguard who carried out the act? Was it the result of court intrigue? Was it Alexander himself? Or whisper it softly, was it Olympus? No one could prove it. No one dared. But many believed it. After all, within days, Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child were dead, murdered. Some say, by Olympus herself. The serpent had returned to the palace, and now nothing stood between her son and the throne. With Philip dead and Macedon in mourning or confusion, Olympias made her move. While others scrambled to understand the chaos, she acted swiftly, brutally, decisively. First, Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian queen and rival wife, was eliminated. According to chilling accounts, Olympus didn't just have her killed. She made her death symbolic, public, humiliating. Some say Cleopatra was forced to hang herself after watching her infant daughter be murdered. Others claim Olympus had the child thrown onto a funeral pyre. What's agreed upon is this: no mercy was shown. Olympia understood what many mothers in ancient courts refused to accept. In a royal palace, mercy is a liability. A rival child, no matter how small, is a future war. And Olympias was done playing defense. With Cleopatra and her bloodline erased, she could turn her attention to securing Alexander's throne. Her teenage son, bold, brilliant, already trained by Aristotle, was declared king without serious opposition. But don't be fooled. It wasn't just his charisma or his father's legacy that made it possible. It was Olympus. She knew which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, and which enemies to quietly remove. She wasn't just protecting her son's rise. She was engineering it. Alexander himself didn't always approve. He reportedly disapproved of the violence against Cleopatra's family. But he also didn't stop it, because deep down he knew what Olympias had always known. Power demands blood. And in Macedon, bloodlines were both a blessing and a curse. With her son now king, Olympias began to recede slightly from public life. But this was no retirement. She simply shifted from open strikes to whispered influence. As Alexander prepared to launch his conquest of Persia, she remained behind, not as a passive queen mother, but as the spiritual guardian of his destiny. She sent him sacred relics, consulted oracles, and performed rituals on his behalf. To Olympus, her son's mission wasn't just military. It was Evai. Alexander wasn't going to war. He was fulfilling prophecy. And as long as she drew breath, no rival, Macedonian, Persian, or otherwise, would derail that divine plan. She had crowned her son. She had cleansed the palace. Now she would guard his empire from behind the curtain with teeth bared. As Alexander marched east to conquer the known world, Olympus remained behind, a queen without a throne, but not without power. Her official title was Queen Mother, but make no mistake, she ruled in all but name. Though regency was technically handed to Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals, Olympus refused to be sidelined. She wrote letters to her son, constantly advising, warning, sometimes chastising him. These weren't the sweet letters of a doting mother. They were political briefings laced with oracles and venom, and Alexander, thousands of miles away, read every word. She reminded him who his true enemies were. She questioned the loyalty of his companions. She criticized his fascination with Persian customs, his choice of wives, and his flirtation with calling himself a god. No one else dared say these things to him, but Olympias was never afraid to speak as a mother or a priestess of divine will. Back in Macedon, Antipater grew increasingly resentful. Olympia undermined him at every turn. She used her status, her religious authority, and her family ties to stir opposition against him. She had influence in Epirus, in Thessaly, and among the aristocracy. She could spread rumors like wildfire, and with Olympus, a whisper could be deadlier than a sword. Meanwhile, her letters to Alexander became more urgent. She warned him of Antipater's ambition, painting him as a second Philip, ready to betray and usurp. Whether she truly believed it, or simply feared losing her grip, she kept pressing her son to act. Alexander, however, hesitated. He needed Antipater to keep order in Greece while he fought in Asia. And so the rift between mother and general widened. Olympia watched. She waited, but beneath her religious robes and maternal concern, she was growing impatient. She hadn't endured years of palace warfare to be ruled over by an old soldier. As Alexander's empire stretched from the Ion to India, Olympia saw cracks forming. He was taking on too much, trusting too many foreign advisors, and drifting away from the mother and the gods that made him. She believed his victories came from divine favor and from her. And if he forgot that, well, Olympus knew how to remind kings who they really were, even if that king was her own son. When news of Alexander's death in Babylon reached Macedon in 323 BCE, it didn't arrive like a trumpet. It arrived like a dagger. For Olympus, it wasn't just the loss of a son. It was the collapse of a world she had spent decades building. Her boy, the divine storm she had prophesied, raised, unleashed, was gone. And he'd left behind no clear heir, no single successor, only chaos. The mighty empire he carved out was already fracturing. Generals, his so-called successors, were already dividing it up like jackals around a corpse. Antipater still held power in Macedon and Greece, and he had no love for Olympia. Worse, her daughter, Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was being courted by rival generals for marriage, each one hoping to use her bloodline as a claim to the throne. Olympia saw what was coming. Civil war wasn't a possibility. It was inevitable. And once again, she would have to act. But she no longer had Alexander. What she had instead was his bloodline. His young son, Alexander IV, born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess Alexander had married. Roxana, still in Macedon, was vulnerable. The boy was even more so. Olympus recognized that the infant was now the last true piece of her son's legacy, and that made him a target, but it also made him a weapon. She allied herself with Roxana and the boy, determined to protect them and use the child's birthright to stake her own claim in the political battlefield. But the tide was turning. The generals who once bowed to Alexander had no interest in kneeling to his widow or his mother. They had armies now, ambitions, and grudges. Olympus didn't flinch. She'd faced snakes, traitors, and kings. A few warlords with crowns and stolen spears wouldn't scare her. So, she plotted. She waited. She watched as Antipater died and was replaced by his son, Cassander, a man with ice in his veins and no tolerance for the old queen's games. It was only a matter of time before these two forces collided. The suppliant mother of Alexander and the cold-deed user who wanted her buried. Alexander was gone, but his shadow was still moving, and Olympus disquilled within it, ready to strike. Years after Alexander's death, while his empire crumbled into civil war, Olympia made her most audacious move yet. She returned to Macedon, not as a grieving mother, but as a political force of divine fury. The regency had been splintered. Cassandra, the son of her old enemy Antipa, was seizing power, and Roxana, along with young Alexander IV, was effectively imprisoned. Olympia saw the writing on the wall. If she did not act now, her grandson would vanish like a shadow at dusk. So she made a deal with Polyperchon, an aging general who still held a flicker of legitimate authority. Olympus would return, not to plead, but to rule. With Polypon's backing, she entered Macedon at the head of an army and the moment her feet touched home soil, everything changed. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers defected to her side. Even some of her old enemies hesitated. Olympias, despite her age, was still a name that shook the ground. Then came her vengeance. One by one, she hunted down the loyalists of Cassander, and when she finally caught Philip III, Alexander's mentally impaired half-brother and puppet king, she ordered his execution. According to some sources, his wife Eurydice was captured and given the opportunity to kill herself. When she refused, Olympus had her It was brutality, veiled in royal protocol, and Olympus, ever theatrical, staged the scene like a goddess delivering justice. Her message was clear. Only the bloodline of Alexander had the right to rule. Everyone else was a pretender. For a brief, burning moment, Olympia held the kingdom in her grip. She had restored the dynasty. She had avenged betrayals. She had reminded Macedon what royal power looked like when wielded by a woman with nothing left to lose. But power in Macedon was like fire in dry grass, and Cassander was still out there calculating, biding his time. He returned with a vengeance. His army outnumbered hers, his resources deeper, his cruelty colder. Her allies began to abandon her. Polyperchon lost influence. The tide turned. Olympus, now isolated in the fortress of Pydna, watched as her enemies closed in. She had lit the match, Macedon had burned, and now the smoke was thick, and her enemies were at the gates. Olympus, once the most feared woman in the ancient world, now found herself besieged in the coastal fortress of Pydna, alone cut off, surrounded by the army of Cassandra, who had come to finish what his father had started. But Olympias didn't beg. She didn't plead. For nearly a year, she endured the siege, like a statue carved from divine wrath. Food ran short. Disease crept in. Allies vanished. Yet within the fortress walls, she maintained the same unshakable presence that had once shaken kings. To the very end, she carried herself not as a prisoner, but as the mother of a god. Cassandra, ever cautious, hesitated. He knew killing Olympus was dangerous. Even now, she carried a myth around her like armor. She was still the mother of Alexander the Great. To strike her down might seem like blasphemy. So, he offered her safety. Surrender, he said, and her life would be spared. Olympia knew better. She had seen too many royal promises turn to ash. Still, hunger was no longer just a discomfort. It was death. Her garrison broke. Her followers surrendered, and Olympias, unbending until the very end, was finally handed over to her enemies. Cassandra didn't kill her himself. That would have been too simple and too merciful. Instead, he turned her over to the families of those she had executed during her brief return to power. Let them decide her fate. They condemned her to death. But here's the catch. When the executioners came, no one dared strike the first blow. Olympia stood tall, regal, silent, eyes fixed on them like an oracle staring through smoke. These were Macedonians. They had grown up hearing of her rituals, her visions, her snakes. They had once cheered her son as a living god, and now here she stood, a frail old woman cloaked in myth, and not a single man had the courage to swing the sword. So Cassandra sent others, foreigners, outsiders, people who had no memory of her power, only orders to follow. And thus, Olympus was finally struck down, not with ceremony, not with dignity, but with silence. Her death marked the end of Alexander's bloodline in any meaningful power, and with it, the final ember of an empire founded on divine ambition was snuffed out. But even in death, Olympus left behind a shadow, and history would never forget the Serpent Queen. Olympus died not on a throne, but in the dust, unarmed, abandoned, and executed by the very people she once ruled. But history is strange. It does not always favor the ones who die in silk sheets. Sometimes it remembers those who went down hissing, and Olympus was never meant for quiet history. In life, she had wielded motherhood like a sword, and prophecy like a shield. She wasn't just the mother of Alexander the Great. She was one of the architects of his rise. Without her, there is no myth of the divine child, no rituals whispering of thunderbolts and lions, no ruthless purging of rivals that cleared the path for a teenage king to rule the known world. Olympus didn't just give birth to an empire, she defended it with claws. Yet, even among the ancient world's most ruthless dynasts, Olympia stands apart. She didn't command armies in the field like Cleopatra or ride into battle like Boudicca. Her battlefield was subtler and colder. It was a world of poisoned goblets, political marriages, priestesses, and oracles. She understood the power of fear, and even more importantly, she understood the power of belief. She made people believe her son was divine, and she may have believed it herself. Her enemies branded her a murderer, a witch, a manipulator, and they weren't wrong. Olympia was all those things and more. She was the product of a brutal world that respected cunning far more than kindness, and she learned early that mercy was a luxury queens couldn't afford. In the centuries that followed, she was both vilified and mythologized. Some called her a villain, others a visionary. But no historian, ancient or modern, could call her irrelevant. She haunted the legacy of Alexander like a phantom, always in the background, always just behind the curtain. And maybe that's exactly where she belonged. Not as a tragic mother or a footnote in a king's story, but as a story unto herself. The woman who wrapped herself in prophecy, slept beside snakes, and outlived gods. Olympia's bones turned to dust long ago. But her legend endures in every tale of ruthless queens, in every whisper of blood-borne destiny, in every empire built on myth. She is still there, coiled in the dark, waiting on the sun-bleached island of Crete. Just a few miles south of the modern city of Hero lies a ruin that feels more like a dream than a real place. Stone corridors snake in all directions, rooms twist and double back. Staircases lead nowhere. It's easy to lose your sense of direction even today. This place is Knesset, the heart of Minoan civilization and the supposed inspiration for one of the most enduring myths in human history, the labyrinth of the Minotaur. But before there was a legend, there was a palace. A palace unlike any other, built around 1900 BCE and expanded over centuries. Nos wasn't just a royal residence. It was an entire city under one roof, covering nearly 150,000 square feet. It featured over 1,000 rooms, light wells, storage magazines, shrines, workshops, and what may have been the first flushing toilets in history. It had running water, multi-story apartments, and an intricate system of air circulation. This wasn't a primitive fortress. It was an architectural masterpiece. To modern archaeologists, Nos looks like organized chaos. To ancient visitors, it probably felt like magic. The man who brought Nos into modern awareness was British archaeologist Arthur Evans. In the early 1900s, Evans excavated the site and quickly became convinced that this was the origin of the Greek labyrinth myth. The layout was disorienting, the architecture deeply symbolic, and everywhere he turned, he found motifs of bulls painted on walls, carved into stone, or sculpted into tiny golden charms. The bull, after all, was sacred to the men. Evans even went so far as to name the civilization after the mythic King Minos. Whether Minos was real or not, his legend became inseparable from the ruins. But here's the twist. No one's found a literal labyrinth. No underground maze. No prison chambers. No half-man monster. What we have instead is something far more mysterious. A city designed in loops, wings, and layers. Deliberately difficult to navigate. And the deeper you go, the more the lines between history and mythology blur. So the question remains, was the Minotaur born from these walls? Or was the palace itself the monster? Nos may not give up its answers easily, but it's very good at making us ask the right questions. The myth is as famous as the ruin. A monstrous half-man, half-bull trapped in a labyrinth so complex that no one who entered ever found their way out. Only Theseus, the Athenian hero, managed to kill the beast and escape thanks to a ball of thread and the cunning of Princess Ariadne. But where did this story come from, and why? A labyrinth. The earliest versions of the myth speak of King Minos, the powerful ruler of Crete, who demanded tribute from Athens, in the form of 7 boys and 7 girls each year. These unfortunate souls were fed to the Minotaur, a creature born from divine punishment and shame. The Minotaur, locked in an underground maze, symbolized the dark underbelly of power, something savage hidden behind grandeur. To ancient Greeks, Crete had long been a land of wealth, mystery, and fear. Its seafaring people, the Minoans, were seen as both elegant and alien. Their rituals involved bulloping. Their artwork depicted strange gods, and their palaces were unlike anything on the mainland. To a visiting Greek from 1000 BCE, Knos might have felt like another world. The bull itself was sacred in Minoan culture. Frescoes show young men and women vaulting over charging bulls in ritual displays. Horns of consecration, stylized bull horns, appear on rooftops and altars. Combine this with a palace that feels like a maze, and the ingredients for a legend begin to stir. But what if the Minotaur wasn't just a monster? What if it was a metaphor? Some scholars believe the tale reflects a memory of Cretan dominance over the Ion, a time when Athens truly did pay tribute to a stronger stranger power. The labyrinth could symbolize the political entrapment of weaker states, and the Minotaur, the raw, terrifying force behind Minoan rule. Others argue it's more psychological, the labyrinth as the unconscious mind, the Minotaur as our hidden urges, and Theseus, the hero walking bravely into the darkness, guided only by the thread of memory. Still, the myth remains tangled with the palace is the closest thing we've ever found to a real labyrinth. No monster, no Ariadne, but perhaps something deeper. Not just a myth echoing through history, but a history that was asking to become myth, long before Athens raised its marble temples or Sparta sharpened its spears. There was the Minoan civilization, one of the earliest advanced societies in Europe. They ruled not through conquest, but through trade, art, and what seems like an almost supernatural command of architecture. At the heart of their power stood Knossos, a palace that wasn't just a seat of royalty. It was a hub of culture, ritual, and economy. The Minoans flourished from around 2600 to 40 CE. Based on Crete, they developed a sprawling trade network that reached Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the distant shores of Spain. Their ships cut through the Mediterranean like silent arrows, Fing pottery, saffron, bronze, and luxury goods. They didn't build vast armies. They built relationships, and that more than weapons made them rich. What's most striking about Minoan culture is how different it was from their later Greek successors. Their artwork celebrated nature, animals, and flowing human movement, not war or divine punishment. Frescoes show dancers, dolphins, and athletes vaulting over bulls. Even their goddesses are different. Powerful, bare-breasted figures often holding snakes, symbols of fertility, transformation, or protection. At the center of it all was Konos, not a fortress on a hill, but a complex in a fertile valley. It had no massive defensive walls, suggesting the Minoans either felt secure on their island or projected enough power to make defense unnecessary. Their confidence was architectural. Multi-story buildings, colonnaded courtyards, and advanced plumbing systems hinted at a society far ahead of its time. And yet, for all their sophistication, the Minoans left behind no deciphered written records. Their primary script, Lineara, remains unreadable to this day. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what their kings believed, what prayers they spoke, or what truly happened behind the walls of Knos. All we have are their ruins, their art and their influence absorbed later by the Mycenaeans and echoed in Greek myths. The Minoans were not just builders of palaces, they were architects of mystery. And Knos wasn't merely a building. It was the beating heart of a civilization that shimmered for a moment, like sunlight on the Aegean, and then vanished. But some say their echo still wanders the maze. To walk through Knossos is to walk through time. Layered, confusing, beautiful time. It's not just the scale that overwhelms you. It's the design. Rooms lead to rooms. Corridors split and vanish. Light wells cut through the heart of the building. Stairs spiral into shadows or emerge suddenly into sunlit courtyards. Nothing moves in a straight line. It's not hard to see why ancient visitors might have whispered labyrinth. Kossos wasn't just a palace. It was a living organism, spanning an estimated 150,000 square ft. The complex contained over 1,000 chambers. Some tiny, some grand. These weren't randomly placed rooms. They were purpose-built workshops, storage spaces, shrines, apartments, and throne rooms, all arranged around a large central courtyard that may have hosted public ceremonies or bulling rituals. The palace was built on multiple levels, up to 4 or 5 stories tall in places, using natural slopes and artificial terraces. To navigate it without getting lost, you'd need memory, instinct, or a thread-like feel. And yet, this apparent chaos hides a remarkable intelligence. The Manowans mastered passive ventilation, cooling rooms through air shafts, and open stairwells. They funneled rainwater through clay pipes and had toilets that flushed long before Rome made it fashionable. One of the most iconic areas is the so-called throne room, named for the alabaster chair built into the wall, flanked by benches. Around it are frescoes of griffins, mythical guardians. Was this the seat of a priest-king, a goddess's chamber, a sacred court? No one knows for certain. And the walls, they speak in color. Vibrant frescoes show dolphins swimming above bathtubs, women in elegant flounced skirts with bare chests, youths leaping bulls mid-air. The art wasn't just decoration. It was identity, fluid, natural, deeply connected to earth and sea. Still, the deeper you go, the more Nos begins to disorient. Some parts seem intentionally complex, like they were designed to confuse. Maybe that's the root of the labyrinth legend. Not a prison for monsters, but a palace that felt alive, a building that invited awe, ritual, and just a touch of fear. No locked doors, no mythical beasts. Just a place built to make you question where you were and what was waiting around the next corner. Nos wasn't just an administrative center or royal residence. It was a place of worship, an architectural expression of the Minoan soul, steeped in ritual, myth, and divine mystery. Unlike later Greek temples, there are no towering columns to Zeus or marble shrines to Athena. Instead, the spiritual world of Knossos is more subtle, woven into the fabric of the building itself. Shrines hide in corners. Pillars rise like sacred sentinels. Horns stylized, carved, symbolic, appear on rooftops and altars. Everywhere you look, the bull motif dominates, suggesting a powerful connection between worship, the natural world, and this revered animal. The Minoans didn't seem to fear the bull. They celebrated it. The famous bull-leaping fresco in Nos isn't just athletic art. It may depict a religious rite, young men and women vaulting over a charging bull, locked in a dance of danger and grace. It wasn't sport. It was sacred theater, possibly an offering to the gods or a symbolic triumph over chaos. Then there are the snake goddesses discovered in storerooms beneath the palace. The snake goddess figurines are among the most iconic Minoan artifacts. Bare-breasted arms raised, with serpents coiled in their hands or around their bodies, these figures radiate power. They are not submissive idols. They are guardians of the household, fertility, and perhaps life itself. To the Minoans, snakes symbolized renewal, rebirth, and mystery. Creatures of both earth and underworld. The rooms where these objects were found hinted household shrines or ritual spaces. Quiet, sacred corners, hidden among the palace's bustling heart. Combined with the fresco, the horns, the altars, and the labyrinthine corridors, the entire complex begins to feel like a ritual machine, a structure built not just for living, but for connecting with the divine. There is no centralized temple at Nos, because the palace itself was a temple. Its layout, art, and design were all part of a spiritual worldview, where boundaries between sacred and secular didn't exist. This was a place where myth was architecture, where a corridor could become a passage to the gods, and where every echo in the stone chambers may have once been a whispered prayer. Nos didn't just house people. It housed gods. For centuries, Nos stood as a beacon of prosperity, innovation, and cultural sophistication. But then, something happened. Something sudden. Something no one can fully explain. By around 1400 BCE, the palace was abandoned. The fresco left to fade, and the Minoan civilization that once ruled the seas had vanished like mist over the Ion. So what happened? Theories abound. Some point to nature. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, erupted in one of the largest explosions in human history. The blast was so massive, it likely caused tsunamis that battered its northern coast, devastating ports and farmland. Ash clouds may have blocked the sun, choking crops and disrupting the climate. While Knesset wasn't immediately destroyed, the aftermath of the eruption may have shaken the foundations economically, politically, and spiritually. Others look to war. By 1450 CE, the rising power of the Mycenaeans. Mainland Greeks may have taken advantage of Minoan weakness. Archaeological evidence suggests Nas was reoccupied briefly, but the culture had changed. The art became more martial. Linear A, the Minoan script, was replaced with Linear B, used by Mycenaean scribes. The palace that once thrived with snake goddesses and bulldozers now whispered in a foreign tongue. Some scholars believe the Mycenaeans didn't invade in a single conquest, but gradually absorbed the island. First through trade, then influence, and finally rule. Others argue that internal collapse, a civil uprising, political instability, or the failure of the elite may have contributed just as much. What's striking, though, is how little violence is evident in the ruins. There are no charred skeletons, no signs of mass slaughter. Nos didn't fall with a scream. It fell with a whisper. The great palatial system simply stopped. The rooms went quiet, the rituals ended, and nature slowly crept back in. By the time Homer sang of Cree in his epics, Nos was already ancient myth, a memory tangled in stories of kings, monsters, and labyrinths. And maybe that's fitting, because what killed Konos wasn't just eruption or invasion, it was time. And the way all great things, no matter how beautiful, eventually vanish beneath the weight of new empires. But the bones remain. And if you listen closely, the maze still hums beneath the earth. For thousands of years, Knossos lay buried beneath the Cretan soil. Just another mound of stone lost to time, its name forgotten, its myths distorted, its walls swallowed by olive groves and dust. That is, until one man decided to chase a legend. His name was Sir Arthur Evans. And he didn't just rediscover Knossos, he reimagined it. In 1900, Evans, a British archaeologist with a flair for drama and a deep love for Homeric myth, purchased the land that covered the ancient ruins. Local farmers had been finding strange seals and artifacts, clues that something enormous lay beneath their feet. Evans dug in. What he found would change the history of the Ion forever. He uncovered a palace so vast, so complex, and so advanced that he was convinced this was the mythical home of King Minos. The fresco, the horns, the sheer architectural strangeness of the site, it all pointed in his mind to one thing: the labyrinth. Evans wasn't just an archaeologist. He was a storyteller, and sometimes a controversial one. He named the people who built Konos, the Manawans, after Minos. He interpreted symbols, reconstructed fresco, and restored parts of the palace using reinforced concrete, a move that has drawn both praise and criticism. Some call it visionary, others call it vandalism, because what you see today at Knossos is partly ancient ruin and partly Edgewordian imagination. Still, Evans did what no one else had dared. He brought Knossos back to life. He gave Europe a glimpse into a Bronze Age world far older than classical Greece, a civilization of art, mystery, and maritime. He also unearthed the still undeciphered Linear Script, opening new questions about language, literacy, and the limits of our historical understanding. But Evans did more than excavate stone. He resurrected a myth and forced historians to reckon with the fact that behind the legend of the labyrinth was something real, something complex, something very human. A palace that felt like a maze, a civilization that slipped into shadow, and a man who peeled back the earth, only to discover a story far stranger and more beautiful than he had imagined. Nosa had slept for 3,000 years. Evans rang the bell that woke it up. Walk through Gnosis, and you're not just walking through architecture, you're walking through a language of symbols. Fresco, carvings, patterns, they're everywhere, but the Manawans didn't leave us a Rosetta Stone. Their primary script, linear A, remains so instead of reading their thoughts, we must see them painted across plaster, carved into walls, and hidden in patterns. What exactly were they trying to say? The art of kinesis is unlike anything in the ancient world. There's no obsession with warfare, no rows of kings or battler-hardened heroes. Instead, we find nature, leaping dolphins, blooming lies, birds in flight, and sacred bulls. The humans are alive, elegant, and often dancing or performing rituals. Even in scenes that suggest danger, there's rhythm and beauty. The Minoans weren't chronicling conquests. They were celebrating life cycles and possibly cosmic order. The most iconic symbol, though, is the double axe or labrys, found throughout Nazan shrines, on fresco, even etched into stones. The double axe is believed to be a religious symbol, possibly tied to female divinity or celestial cycles. Some suggest the very word labyrinth might derive from labis, making the labyrinth not a maze at all, but a house of the double axe, a sacred space, not a trap. Then there are the horns of consecration, stylized bull horns placed at top walls and altars. These may have been religious markers, separating sacred space from the mundane. Combined with frequent depictions of bulls and bulloping rituals, it's clear the animal had deep spiritual significance. Whether it represented nature, fertility, chaos, or a divine presence, no one agrees. But the bull is everywhere. Even the layout of Konos may have symbolic meaning. Some archaeologists believe it was built not just for function, but to mirror celestial or seasonal patterns. Its winding corridors and nested rooms could represent a journey through life, through death, through the underworld. A spiritual maze, not a physical prison, but without a deciphered script. Every theory walks a thin line between insight and imagination. The Manawans spoke in symbols, not stories, and so we're left to interpret. What is Nos saying? We hear the rhythms, we see the images, but the meaning that remains just out of reach, like a thread unraveling into myth. Nos is a ruin, yes, but it doesn't feel dead. Walk its corridors today, and you'll sense something humming just beneath the surface. Not ghosts, not gods, but echoes of myths, of lives, of questions that refuse to go away thousands of years after its fall. Nos still holds us in its maze. Tourists wander its halls. Archaeologists dig for answers, and writers spin new tales, inspired by its shadow. The Minotaur may be myth, but the feeling of the labyrinth is real. We don't know who ruled Nos. We don't know the names of its kings, queens, or priests. We don't know the prayers they whispered, or the laws they lived by. But we know they loved beauty. We know they worshipped nature. We know they understood balance between architecture and art, between ritual and reality. And we know they were the first. Before the Parthenon, before Rome, before the Hebrew temples or the Persian palaces, there was no a palace that was also a city that was also a temple that may have also been a story, because perhaps that's what the labyrinth really is. Not a prison, not a puzzle, but a narrative carved in stone, a myth in architectural form. The legend of the Minotaur didn't arise from nothing. It came from this place, from the confusion of its corridors, the reverence of its bull rituals, and the awe it inspired in generations who tried to make sense of it. The Greeks turned it into a story. We turned it into archaeology. But at its core, Nos has always been both. Today, we can walk its ruins in broad daylight. We can take photos, draw maps, and even reconstruct its fresco. But the mystery hasn't vanished. The line between fact and legend still shimmers like heat over stone. Maybe that's why Gnosis endures, because it doesn't give us all the answers. It reminds us that sometimes history isn't meant to be solved. It's meant to be felt, and Nos, ancient, tangled, half-remembered, isn't just a place on a map. It's a question, one that leads us deeper with every step. And like Theseus, we're all still following the thread. Ancient engineers knew exactly what they were doing. The earliest rams were handheld. Teams of soldiers simply lifted a tree trunk and smashed it against enemy defenses like frenzied lumberjacks. But over time the battering ram evolved. Engineers realized that mounting the ram inside a wheeled frame, often with a roof to protect the crew from arrows and boiling oil, turned it from a tool into a weapon of terror. The Assyrians, masters of siege warfare, turned rams into psychological weapons. Their siege towers combined rams with archer platforms, meaning a city's gates were being destroyed while defenders were under constant fire. Relief carvings from Nineveh show rams with pointed iron tips rolling up to the gates of rebellious cities like slow-motion gods of destruction. And it wasn't just the front door they were smashing. Rams were often used to breach weak points in walls, batter down watchtowers, or collapse gates entirely. Their presence meant one thing: surrender or watch your defenses crumble like stale bread. The Greeks refined them. The Romans perfected them. Roman engineers built massive rams called ares, Latin for ram, suspended with chains or ropes inside enormous siege shelters. Some were so big they needed dozens of men to operate, and the rhythm of their swinging beam was said to sound like thunder rolling across stone. And yet, for all their brute force, battering rams required serious teamwork. Operators had to keep the ram swinging in sync while also defending it from burning missiles, stones, and all manner of foul substances hurled from above. A stalled ram was a dead ram. Still, when a battering ram got going, really going, it was unstoppable. Wooden muscle versus human masonry. It was ancient physics, weaponized, and it was only the beginning of how engineers would make walls weep. If the battering ram was the brute, the catapult was the tactician. Where rams smashed close up, catapults attacked from a distance, launching not just stones, but psychological dread. They were the first real artillery pieces in military history, and they revolutionized siege warfare by weaponizing physics in ways that felt almost magical to the enemy. The earliest catapults emerged from the Greek world around the 4th century BC, a product of brilliant minds who wanted to add range and momentum to warfare. Dionysius the Fur of Syracuse, a tyrant with a taste for cutting-edge violence, commissioned the first torsion-powered catapults, devices that used twisted bundles of sinew or hair as tension springs. These weren't slingshots for giants, they were precise instruments of siege terror. The genius lay in their mechanics. Engineers figured out that by twisting ropes tightly, often made from animal sinew, they could store enormous amounts of potential energy. When released, this force could hurl stones, javelins, or even flaming projectiles, hundreds of meters. The two main types evolved quickly: the ballista, which launched massive bolts like a giant crossbow, and the stone-throwing catapult, which lobbed boulders over walls or directly at fortifications. Then came the Roman engineers, who never met a Greek idea they couldn't improve. They built catapults that could be broken down, packed onto carts, and reassembled on site. Portable siege engines for professional armies. Some Roman catapults could fire 60-pound stones at incredible speeds, capable of tearing through wooden gates, battlements, and occasionally unlucky soldiers. Catapults weren't just about destruction. They were about spectacle. Ancient generals used them to send messages, sometimes literally. Corpses were launched over walls to spread disease and fear. Severed heads were lobbed into besieged cities to shatter morale. In one chilling case, diseased bodies were fired into enemy territory as an early form of biological warfare. But catapults had their flaws. They were heavy, required skilled crews, and could be rendered useless by bad terrain. Still, when set up properly, they could batter a city into submission from a safe distance. And for the first time in history, cities realized their thick stone walls didn't just need to withstand a ram. They had to survive the skies. Because now, destruction came flying. If the catapult was clever, the trebuchet was majestic, towering, creaking, and terrifying. It was the undisputed king of medieval siege warfare. When one appeared on the battlefield, it wasn't just a weapon. It was a statement. It said, "Your walls mean nothing." Unlike its tension-powered cousins, the trebuchet relied on gravity. At its core was a simple principle: a long swinging arm mounted on a sturdy frame with a heavy counter on one end and a sling on the other. Raise the weight, let it drop, and the arm would whip around, flinging the sling and its deadly payload in a high arc over enemy defenses. It was controlled destruction, precise, predictable, and devastating. The origin of the trebuchet can be traced back too early. Traction models used by the Chinese as early as the 4th century BCE, where manpower replaced counterweights, but the counterweight trebuchet, the version that would rewrite siege warfare in Europe and the Islamic world, emerged in the 12th century, possibly through Byzantine or Muslim intermediaries. Once Europe got its hands on the design, it spread like wildfire through castles and crusades. The power was astonishing. A well-built trebuchet could launch 300-pound projectiles over 300 meters. Stones the size of furniture would crash into towers, pulverize walls, or crater enemy morale. But the real magic was in the arc. Unlike catapults, trebuchets could hurl projectiles over walls with finesse. This meant they weren't just smashing defenses, they were hitting courtyards, barracks, and supply depots inside. And it wasn't just stones. Trebuchets hurled everything. Diseased animals, burning pitch, pots of lime to blind defenders, even messages or insults wrapped around rocks. One legendary account from the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland tells of Warwolf, a trebuchet so massive that the enemy surrendered before it was even fired. The king refused to accept the surrender, just so he could test the machine. But for all its destructive glory, the trebuchet wasn't fast. It took hours to build, minutes to reload, and demanded skilled engineers. Still, no other siege weapon combined range, force, and psychological horror quite like it. It was the medieval version of a slow-motion hammer from the heavens. And when that counterweight dropped, cities held their breath. While catapults launched from afar and battering rams smashed the gates, siege towers took a more personal approach. They rolled right up to the enemy's front door and dropped off armed invaders. Imagine a wooden skyscraper on wheels covered in wet hides to prevent fire, bristling with archers and that was the siege tower, the ancient equivalent of an armored personnel carrier and a mobile fortress in one. And when one of these started rumbling toward your city walls, you knew that the real fight was about to begin. Siege towers weren't subtle. They were big, bold, and terrifyingly effective when used properly. The Assyrians may have been among the first to deploy them in the 9th century BC, but it was the Greeks, and especially the Hellenistic kingdoms, that took the design to theatrical extremes. During the siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE, the Macedonian general Demetrius built a 9-story tower called the Helpolis, or Taker of Cities. It was over 100 feet tall, equipped with catapults, covered in iron plates, and moved by thousands of soldiers. It also broke under its own weight, but the ambition unmatched. The logic behind siege towers was simple. Walls only work if you can't get over them. Siege towers eliminated that advantage by creating an elevated platform from which attackers could descend onto the battlements, bypassing gates and scaling ladders. From the top deck, archers could rain death down onto defenders, while troops on the lower levels prepared to board. But these towers weren't invincible. They were slow, vulnerable to mud, and prime targets for defenders with fire arrows, rolling boulders, or even sabotaged terrain. Smart defenders would dig ditches, flood mows, or build secondary inner walls, known as counter-scarp defenses, just to stop a tower's approach. Still, when they worked spectacularly. A breach in the wall was one thing, but having your own rampart suddenly crowded with enemy soldiers, that was chaos. Siege towers transformed the battlefield from a horizontal contest of strength to a vertical race for survival. They made height an asset and a liability. And once the gangplank dropped from a siege tower to the city walls, there was no turning back. It was time for hand-to-hand hell. While rams smashed in trebuchet's sword, some of the most devastating siege tactics happened silently underground. Siege tunneling or sapping was the dark art of defeating a city by removing the ground it stood on. Literally, the idea was ancient and horrifyingly effective. Dig beneath the enemy's wall, prop it up with wooden supports, then set those supports on fire. When the timbers burned away, the tunnel collapsed, taking the foundation of the wall with it. One moment, your city stood strong. The next, a massive section of the outer wall crumbled like stale bread. This method didn't look glorious. There were no grand engines or thunderous launches. But tunneling was the slow, invisible killer of fortress warfare. The Assyrians practiced early versions of it, but the technique reached full maturity with the Greeks, Persians, and later medieval European armies. During the siege of Plataea in 429 B.C., the Spartans attempted tunneling beneath the walls, only for the defenders to dig counter-tunnels and intercept them mid-dig, turning the soil into a knife-fight nightmare. This defensive tactic became known as countermining, and it added an eerie element to siege warfare. Imagine soldiers digging in pitch black, hundreds of feet beneath the earth, listening for the sound of enemy picks. The moment they heard tapping, they'd race to intercept, often resulting in violent, claustrophobic skirmishes fought by torchlight with knives and shovels. There was no glory in it, just terror, suffocation, and dirt. But when undermining worked, the results were catastrophic. One of the most infamous examples came in 1212 during the siege of Rochester Castle in England. King John's forces tunneled beneath the southern wall, packed the mine with pig fat, and set it ablaze. The supports collapsed, bringing down the entire tower above. The defenders were stunned, and soon after surrendered. By the 13th century, siege engineers became specialists in identifying weak foundations, measuring the soil's behavior, and planning collapses with terrifying precision. They were geologists and demolitionists rolled into one, and though tunneling required time, labor, and a bit of madness, it proved one truth about siege warfare. If you couldn't go over the wall, and you couldn't go through it, you could always take it down from below. Not all the drama of siege warfare came from the attackers. For every ram built or tower rolled forward, defenders had their own deadly tricks, and sometimes those tricks were hot. Let's start with the most terrifying of them all. Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantine around the 7th century CE, Greek fire was a mysterious, napalm-like substance that could stick to ships, walls, and flesh, and kept burning even on water. Sprayed from siphons or hurled in clay pots, it created scenes of pure chaos. To this day, no one knows exactly how it was made. The formula was so secret that it died with the empire, but its effects legendary. Entire fleets were reduced to flaming skeletons within minutes. And that was just the start. In more low-tech defenses, boiling liquids were the go-to weapons of choice. Boiling water, oil, or sand would be poured from murder holes, those quaint openings in the ceilings of gateways or towers directly onto invaders below. Oil was especially feared. Unlike water, it clung to skin, soaking into clothes and armor before being set alight. Imagine climbing a siege ladder only to be greeted with fire you could never put out. Hot sand, though less dramatic, was vicious in its own right. It would slip into the gaps of armor, especially around the neck or wrists, causing second- and third-degree burns as it cooked the flesh beneath. It didn't look impressive from a distance, but it turned bold warriors into screaming wrecks in seconds. Defenders also relied on the good old laws of physics. Gravity became a weapon. Giant stones, logs, or even dead animals were dropped from parapets onto siege engines or dense formations of troops. The goal wasn't just to kill, it was to break the machines and morale at once. And then there were traps, hidden pits, collapsing bridges, spiked barricades. Castles became puzzles of pain designed to slow, confuse, and punish. All of this served one purpose: delay. Every minute a wall held was a minute closer to enemy supply lines running thin, to disease spreading in camps, or to reinforcements arriving. Siege warfare was a game of attrition, and while the attackers had physics on their side, the defenders had creativity and a whole lot of boiling rage. In siege warfare, raw destruction was only half the goal. The other half was psychological domination, breaking the will of the defenders before the walls even came down. Siege weapons weren't just tools of war. They were massive, creaking, flaming, symbols of doom. Every groaning wheel of a siege tower, every arcing boulder flung by a trebuchet, was designed to plant one seed in the minds of those behind the walls. You are not safe. Ancient commanders knew this. The Assyrians paraded their siege engines openly, dragging them across deserts with grand fanfare. The Romans built their siege camps right in view of the enemy, letting defenders watch as battering rams were assembled and catapults tested. Siege was theater, and fear was part of the script. Sometimes the payloads themselves carried a message. Severed heads of messengers or generals would be launched over the walls, often still wearing their armor. At the siege of Constantinople, defenders were bombarded not only with rocks, but with diseased corpses launched to spread panic and plague. During the Mongol siege of Kafira in 1346, it's believed that hurling plague-infected corpses over the walls helped trigger outbreaks of the Black Death in Europe. The trebuchet wasn't just a weapon, it was an announcement. When one of these giants was rolled into place, everyone inside the fortress could hear it before they saw it. The creaking of winches, the grinding of ropes, the heavy thunk of the counterweight, like the heartbeat of an incoming storm. But the most dangerous part, the unknown. You never knew what was coming next. Would it be a rock, a barrel of fire, a rain of arrows, or just silence? Ominous, heavy silence as engineers adjusted their aim. Even the sounds became psychological weapons. The rhythmic thump of a battering ram, or the sudden silence before a shot would drive defenders mad with anticipation. For commanders, the goal was to create despair, to convince the enemy that resistance was pointless, that their gods had abandoned them, that their walls were nothing but temporary obstacles in the path of fate. And when that mental dam finally cracked, the gates often opened without a fight, because in siege warfare, sometimes the mind collapsed before the masonry. As gunpowder thundered onto the battlefield in the late medieval era, the age of traditional siege engines came to a slow, splintering end. But their legacy didn't vanish. It evolved. The invention of cannons changed everything. A single well-placed shot from a cannon could do in seconds what a trebuchet took hours to achieve. Stone walls, once considered impenetrable, became liabilities. By the 15th century, the great castles of Europe were crumbling, not from undermining or fire, but from iron balls crashing through their parapets. Siege warfare had entered its next phase. Explosive, brutal, and deafening. And yet, the principles laid down by ancient siege engineers never disappeared. Modern artillery still owes a debt to the catapult and trebuchet. Every ballistic missile and long-range howitzer is just a high-tech descendant of the same question. How do you break what's meant to be unbreakable from a distance? Physics, trajectory, tension, and force, all discovered, tested, and perfected centuries before gunpowder ever entered the story. Even military psychology today, shock and awe, overwhelming firepower, has its roots in ancient siege tactics. Those towering siege engines rolling forward with flags snapping in the wind were the original shock, and they weren't just about breaching a wall. They were about breaking the spirit of a city. You can still see their legacy etched into the ruins of ancient cities. At Masada, where Roman siege ramps still scar the desert. At Constantinople, where layers of walls stood for 1,000 years against every machine imaginable, until cannon fire finally brought them down at castles across Europe, where round towers and angled bastions tell the story of a world constantly redesigning itself to survive the next siege. And today, even in a world of drones and Saratoga-wide missiles, siege warfare hasn't vanished. It's just gone digital. Cities are still surrounded. Defenders are still isolated. Walls are now firewalls, blockades, or even media blackouts. But the soul of the siege remains the same. Someone wants in. Someone wants to keep them out. And both are willing to wait, build, and break to win. The battering rams are gone. The trebuchets are museum pieces. But the spirit of siege warfare, it's as alive and as destructive as ever.